Welcome back to Free Media. I'm Robby Soave.
And I'm Amber Duke.
Well, during a sit-down with French President Emmanuel Macron, President Trump was asked if he would call Russian President Vladimir Putin a dictator after saying the same thing about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's watch his response.
President, you called Zelensky a dictator. Would you use the same words regarding Putin?
I don't use those words lightly. I think that we're going to see how it all works out. Let's see what happens. I think we have a chance of a really good settlement between various countries. And, you know, you're talking about Europe, and you're talking about Ukraine as part of that whole situation. The other side has a lot of support also. So let's see how it all works out. It might work out. Look, you can never make up lives. The one thing you can make up the money, but you can't make up the lives. A lot of lives lost. I think probably a lot more lives than people are talking about. It's been a rough war, but I think we're close to getting it solved. Go ahead.
This comes after Trump called Zelensky a, quote, dictator without elections in a recent social media rant.
So I agree with a lot of what Trump said in that clip. I agree with the diplomacy he's doing. I think it's crazy that the U.S. government for 3 years under Joe Biden had no communication with Russian President Vladimir Putin whatsoever. I don't think it was helpful to call Zelensky a dictator and then pull your punches when you're describing Putin. I don't think it was fair to say that it's not Zelensky's fault. The war started. Russia did invade their country. Now, if you want to use diplomatic language and avoid saying really confrontational things about other leaders, many of them very imperfect, I think that's fine. I think he shouldn't have said it about Zelensky and then refused to say about Putin. But I agree with this. We need to have diplomacy and we need to bring this war to an end, and that I'm all for. And I've been very critical of things the Zelensky administration has done, including suspending rival political parties and independent media. But I'm not so, some of the right is too focused on just like bashing Zelensky. I don't think that's where we should be. He's trying to defend his country, they got invaded. But the money's gonna end and we need to have peace.
Yeah, I agree with those last 2 points. I would throw in the other thing that has led people to be very critical of Zelensky was going after Orthodox religions that he viewed as being too close to Russia. And some people have pointed out that it's the legislature in Ukraine that has passed a lot of the laws related to wartime policies. However, the one that they're referencing does have an explicit carve-out for religious activity. So in that case, I do put the blame on him. But I always think about these things in terms of how Trump tends to overstate his position and then pull it back as a means of negotiations and diplomacy. We talked about this previously on this show in relation to the tariffs against Canada and Mexico and trying to use that as a tool or an incentive for those countries to do certain things related to border security. And in this case, because of the fact that Russian President Vladimir Putin has signaled some willingness to come to the negotiating table. There was reportedly talks between Russia and Ukraine early on in the war that were shut down by Boris Johnson and perhaps Joe Biden. So I almost wonder if he's trying to ratchet up the pressure on Zelensky in particular, because Zelensky has said that basically there's no settlement that he'd be happy with. He's not willing to cede any land. He's not willing to acquiesce to any compromise with Russia whatsoever. So is this sort of like a throw the hammer down on Zelensky so that he kind of has no choice, if he's losing popular support thanks to Trump's language, to be a little bit more willing to negotiate? But that's sort of my 4D chess take.
I'm also, perfectly happy to put the dictator label down on virtually everyone who serves in political office at all, because I always feel like my precious freedoms are being violated.
Yeah.
I'm like, actually, we were talking about this on Rising, and Niall, who often co-hosts with me and sometimes co-hosts with you, was horrified that I had said, like, yeah, everyone's a dictator. They're all dictators. And he was like truly shocked. I'm like, I think every U.S. president, probably other than Calvin Coolidge, has been a dictator. But he was surprised by that. Also, we're not familiar with this whole suspend the elections because there's a war going tradition that does take place in Europe. He did have the authority to do that, but like, we still had a presidential election. I know we weren't under literal invasion.
Not
but,
since the Civil War.
Well, we had one. We had an election during the Civil War, right? We didn't.
Yeah, but they did
postpone our
suspend
elections.
habeas corpus.
Yes, and for that reason, I have described, and many libertarians do describe Abraham Lincoln as a dictator. Like, that's not a controversial thing to say among libertarians.
Actually, my most libertarian take is that when people say Lincoln's their favorite president, I'm like, why? Because he got rid of your civil liberties.
Yeah. FDR put Asian people in prison,
internment
Japanese
camps.
people, internment camps. Yeah. That was dictator shit. I would say that, right?
I think that's fine, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a little weird to be, again, I'm not overly focused on like bashing or attacking Zelensky, and I certainly don't want to downplay that Vladimir Putin, also a bad guy. One of the more perceptive things Trump initially said about years and years ago in an interview, I believe with Bill O'Reilly, where O'Reilly said, okay, but Putin's a killer and a thug, right? And Trump's response was, well, there's a lot of killers and thugs out there, Bill. And that was oh my God, he just said the thing you're not supposed to say, which is that our allies and adversaries alike, our own government engages in a lot of morally reprehensible conduct that we could be more realistic about. And moving our foreign policy in a more realistic direction is something that I think is good, and we have to bring this war to an end, and I hope Zelensky realizes that.
Yeah, I mean, from an international relations perspective, Trump has been probably the most realist president we've had in the modern era, especially vocally and publicly about where he stands on these issues. And I think one of the problems with why people get so worked up about the Ukraine-Russia question is that they legitimately view it as a battle of good versus evil. And nothing in foreign policy is that simplistic, and it's really naive to suggest otherwise, particularly when Ukraine does have a lot of corruption.
Yeah.
A lot of the money we've sent them has been misused. A lot of it is completely unaccounted for. The Pentagon does not even know where a lot of this money ended up and has lost some themselves to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. So the idea that we are just some piggy bank that Ukraine just gets to pull out of because they're ostensibly the good guys is such like a simpleton take.
And even if it was good versus evil, what are we supposed to do more than we've already done? There's not a willingness among the American people to send American troops, to use American weapons to fire, to use nuclear weapons to actually enforce a no-fly zone, which would put us in direct military confrontation with Russia. We are not willing to do that. Even the Biden administration was not willing to do that, as supportive as they were of the Ukrainian resistance. So if you're not willing to do any of that, then we have to live in reality. We have to say, well, how can we're not willing to actually have World War III over this. We don't want to have World War III in a conflict where the stakes are a little bit more good versus evil, like Taiwan and China, where it is closer to good versus evil. We don't want to, now we want to discourage them from doing that invasion, but we don't want to actually have that war because war is really bad.
And in this case, you already have North Korea helping the Russians, and you would probably see some kind of response from China. I don't know if it would be a full military response, but if the U.S. decided to go to war with Russia right now,
let's not do it.
Yeah, it's a bad idea.
Let's let
I'm not interested in it.
Cooler heads prevail.
And if there is an argument for Zelensky being a bad guy or a dictator, it's that his complete unwillingness to negotiate with Russia has killed so many unnecessary. There's been so many unnecessary deaths of Ukrainians because of him, because he operates in this sort of fantasy land that Ukraine is just going to stand along the border with U.S. weapons for 20 years until Russia finally gets bored and gives up.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. We need peace now. Thanks for watching Free Media this week. We'll be back with more content next week. Tune in then.